Hollywood has always had its secrets, but one of the darkest is just how much the Mafia had to do with it. The mob wasn't just watching movies like The Godfather or Scarface, they were shaping the industry itself. From backroom deals to controlling unions and even financing films with dirty money, the Mafia's shadow has been hanging over Hollywood for decades. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on how the mob really took over the movies. In the 1930s, Hollywood was already the dream factory of America. The studios were booming, producing films that gave people hope during the Great Depression, and stars were becoming larger-than-life figures whose names echoed across the world. But while the big movie moguls were busy running their empires from offices lined with cigars and contracts, another kind of empire was quietly taking notice. It wasn't made of producers or directors, but of gangsters in sharp suits and fedora hats. For Italian-American mobsters, Hollywood represented more than just glitz and glamour. It was a wide-open market, a place where influence could be bought, pressure could be applied, and fortunes could be multiplied. The Mafia, already a rising power on the East Coast, began to extend its reach westward, and Hollywood quickly became a tempting target. At first, the mobsters didn't necessarily care about the movies themselves. They weren't trying to write scripts or direct films. What they cared about was power. And power in Hollywood didn't just come from the studios. It came from the networks of unions that kept the entire machine running. Every reel of film that rolled through a projector, every set built on a backlot, every truck that delivered props or costumes to a soundstage relied on armies of workers. And those workers were organized into unions. If you could control the unions, you could control Hollywood itself. That was the opening the Mafia saw, and they wasted no time stepping in. By the mid-1930s, mobsters had already begun to infiltrate trade unions across the country. Trucking, dockwork, construction, any industry that moved money was ripe for control. Hollywood, with its booming budgets and need for constant labor, fit perfectly into this pattern. One of the first unions the mob focused on was the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, better known as IATSE. This group represented projectionists, stage hands, and technical workers, people who might not have been seen by the public, but without whom no movie could be shown or produced. If the mob controlled IATSE, they could essentially choke the flow of movies from studio to screen. And choke it they did. Mob figures began muscling into IATSE leadership, using bribes, threats, and good old-fashioned muscle to push aside anyone who resisted. Projectionists were told in no uncertain terms, toe the line or else. Stagehands found themselves suddenly paying fees that didn't come from their official dues, but from envelopes slipped into mob-controlled offices. Truck drivers who moved film reels and equipment from one lot to another were forced into contracts that bled them dry. All of it was enforced with the kind of intimidation Hollywood executives weren't used to dealing with. Producers might have been masters of contracts and clauses, but contracts meant nothing when a gangster in a fedora was waiting outside your office door. One of the key figures in this infiltration was Willie Bioff, a mobster with ties to Chicago's outfit. Bioff wasn't the stereotypical Hollywood type. He wasn't suave or charismatic, but he was ruthless, and that was exactly what the mob needed. Through a mixture of threats and deals, Bioff gained enormous influence over IATSE in the late 1930s. His partnership with mob boss Frank Nitti Al Capone's successor in Chicago, made him a kind of gatekeeper between the studios and the workforce. If a studio wanted its movie to be made on time, without strikes or technical difficulties, it had to play ball with Bioff and his associates. The scheme worked like this. Bioff would demand payments from the studios in exchange for labor peace. If the money came in, production ran smoothly. If it didn't, suddenly workers were calling strikes, projectionists were walking out, or truckloads of film reels just didn't show up at theaters. The studios had little choice. Payoffs became part of the cost of doing business, quietly folded into budgets alongside salaries and set construction. MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, all the giants of the silver screen found themselves paying under the table to keep the mob happy. For mobsters, it was a gold mine. Hollywood money was clean, at least on the surface, and there was so much of it. A single studio picture could employ hundreds of workers, each one vulnerable to pressure. Bioff and his associates skimmed off thousands, sometimes millions, without ever needing to touch the movies themselves. They didn't care about the art. They cared about the leverage, and the leverage was enormous. It wasn't just about money, though. The Mafia also understood the power of prestige. Being able to say you had influence in Hollywood gave mobsters a kind of status they couldn't get just by running rackets back east. Hollywood was glamorous, filled with stars and red carpets, and for men who had clawed their way out of immigrant slums, rubbing shoulders with actors and directors felt like another kind of victory. The mob's presence became an open secret. Everyone knew unions were mobbed up, but few dared say it out loud. The mob's methods were simple, brutal, and effective. Extortion was the backbone. Threaten a strike here, demand a payment there, and always remind the studios of what could happen if they said no. Intimidation kept the workers in line. A projectionist who refused to cooperate might find himself beaten or worse. A truck driver who talked too much might simply disappear from the route. Fear was a tool, and the mob wielded it with precision. The ripple effects spread across Hollywood. Studio heads, desperate to keep their schedules and budgets intact, often cooperated quietly. Police and politicians, some of whom were already on the mob's payroll, looked the other way. Even the FBI in those years struggled to penetrate the Mafia's grip, as J. Edgar Hoover was famously reluctant to admit how powerful organized crime had become. For the better part of a decade, the mob ran Hollywood's labor force like a shadow government. But while the Mafia was squeezing money from studios and unions, they were also planting seeds that would shape the culture of the movies themselves. Writers and directors, aware of the mob's growing presence, began to incorporate gangsters more prominently into film scripts. Movies like Angels with Dirty Faces and The Roaring Twenties tapped into America's fascination with crime, drawing inspiration not just from history, but from the very real men who were now sitting in smoky rooms just a few miles from the Hollywood sign. The mob wasn't writing the stories, but their influence was bleeding onto the screen all the same. By the end of the 1930s, Hollywood was fully entangled. The mob had wormed its way into the system, turning unions into cash machines and executives into reluctant partners. For the gangsters, it was proof of a larger truth. Power wasn't just about bullets and back alleys anymore. Power could come from boardrooms, from contracts, from the simple fact that a film couldn't roll without their say-so. Hollywood was theirs to squeeze, and squeeze it They did. The 1940s opened with Hollywood stronger than ever. America was at war, but the movies were booming. Stars like Humphrey Bogart, James Cagney, and Rita Hayworth filled the screens with characters that defined the era. Studios had mastered the system of contracts, the star machine was in full swing, and audiences packed theaters week after week. To the public, Hollywood looked untouchable, a place of pure glamour and American pride. But behind the lights and cameras, the Mafia was embedding itself even deeper into the industry, shifting from labor racketeering into something far more profitable: money laundering. The mob had always needed clean fronts for their dirty cash. Illegal gambling, bootlegging, and loan sharking produced millions that couldn't just sit in banks without raising eyebrows. The movies, with their massive budgets, complicated accounting, and constant flow of cash, were perfect vehicles to wash money. By the mid-1940s, mobsters weren't just leaning on unions anymore. They were starting to funnel their own money into Hollywood productions, sometimes openly, sometimes through backdoor deals. If a studio needed financing for a risky project, a mob-connected investor might appear with cash in hand. The terms were always generous on the surface, but the reality was brutal. Repayment was expected whether the film succeeded or failed. At the same time, Las Vegas was beginning to rise out of the Nevada desert. What had once been a dusty railroad stop was transforming into the gambling capital of the world, thanks in no small part to mob money. Bugsy Siegel, the flamboyant gangster with Hollywood dreams of his own, played a key role in building the Flamingo Hotel, the first modern Vegas resort. Siegel's connections to Hollywood were deep. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a socialite, rubbing shoulders with stars like Clark Gable, Cary Grant, and even studio executives. His Hollywood friends loved his charisma, and Siegel loved their fame. Through Siegel and men like him, the pipeline between Hollywood and Las Vegas opened wide. Money from mob-run casinos in Vegas flowed back into Hollywood, sometimes to finance films, other times to bankroll lavish parties and lifestyles. Actors, singers, and producers began to frequent Vegas, often receiving VIP treatment courtesy of mob bosses who wanted to keep the stars close. Frank Sinatra, who would later become the face of the Rat Pack, developed strong ties with Chicago outfit figures like Sam Giancana. To many, it seemed like a natural friendship, entertainers and businessmen mingling in Vegas, but behind the scenes, it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The mob gained legitimacy and access to powerful social circles, while the stars gained protection, opportunities, and in some cases, direct favors that could make or break careers. By the late 1940s, federal authorities were starting to pay attention. Congressional hearings into organized crime, like the Kefauver Committee in the early 1950s, pulled back the curtain on just how deep mob influence ran. The hearings revealed details of how mobsters skimmed profits from Vegas casinos, but also how that money made its way into unions and industries far from Nevada. Hollywood was one of the places where the fingerprints kept showing up, even if the evidence was often circumstantial. Executives rarely admitted anything outright. No studio head wanted to say publicly that his latest picture had been partly financed by a gangster. But in whispered conversations, in private dinners at Beverly Hills mansions, the deals were done. What made Hollywood so appealing to the mob wasn't just the money. It was also the culture of secrecy. Studios were used to covering things up, from scandals involving their stars to shady accounting practices that hid profits from actors. Adding mob money into the mix wasn't a huge leap. Everyone got what they wanted. The mob got a laundry service for its cash, and the studios got financial lifelines and labor peace. For the average moviegoer, nothing seemed different. The screen still lit up with musicals, noir thrillers, and war dramas, but behind the scenes, the Mafia was becoming a quiet partner in the industry. As the 1950s dawned, the relationship between Hollywood and the mob grew more personal. Celebrities, drawn to the excitement and luxury of Vegas, became close to mob bosses. Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Frank Sinatra the Rat Pack embodied this connection more than anyone else. They performed at mob-controlled casinos, attended private parties with gangsters, and in Sinatra's case, even acted as a kind of informal liaison between mobsters and politicians. Sinatra's friendship with Sam Giancana became so well known that the FBI kept files on both men. Logged. These relationships were not just social. When stars needed something, the mob could provide it. A role, a contract renegotiation, even help in silencing scandal favors flowed both ways. In return, celebrities gave mobsters legitimacy and a sheen of Hollywood glamour. For mob bosses who had spent their early lives in the shadows, posing for pictures with famous actors was more than vanity. It was a statement of power. Meanwhile, the unions in Hollywood remained a steady source of revenue. Though Willie Byoff had been exposed and convicted in the early 1940s, the system he and his partners built didn't disappear. Other mob-connected figures took his place, ensuring that projectionists, truck drivers, and stagehands continued to pay tribute. Extortion was institutionalized. If a studio wanted to avoid strikes or delays, it had to keep making those quiet payments. For decades, this was simply accepted as the cost of doing business. The mob's influence even began shaping the kinds of stories Hollywood told. Crime films, already popular in the 1930s and 40s, took on new dimensions in the post-war years. Movies like On the Waterfront, directed by Elia Kazan in 1954, portrayed union corruption in ways that echoed real-life mafia control of labor. While On the Waterfront was partly inspired by New York dock workers' struggles, audiences and critics alike couldn't help but notice the parallels with what was happening in Hollywood itself. The line between art and reality was becoming blurred. In the shadows, mobsters were learning to play the long game. They no longer needed to rely only on brute force. Influence and subtle pressure were often enough. Studio executives, always wary of bad publicity, preferred quiet cooperation. Politicians, dazzled by the combination of Hollywood glamour and mob money, often turned a blind eye. Even the FBI, despite mounting evidence, struggled to mount significant prosecutions until much later. For the Mafia, Hollywood was a low-risk, high-reward venture. By the 1960s, the relationship between Hollywood and the mob had become so normalized that few insiders even questioned it. Mobsters attended film premieres, mingled at Academy Award parties, and in some cases even appeared in movies themselves. Extras and minor roles sometimes went to associates as favors. Stars continued to perform at mob-run Vegas casinos, cementing the bond between the two worlds. Yet this period also marked the beginning of cracks in the facade. As television grew in popularity, Hollywood's dominance began to waver, and the mob's stranglehold on certain unions faced new challenges. Younger workers, less afraid of the old ways, sometimes resisted. Law enforcement, pressured by public concern over organized crime, stepped up investigations. Still, the mob's legacy from these decades was undeniable. They had gone from shaking down stagehands to becoming shadow investors in films and trusted confidants of stars. The story of Hollywood in the 1940s through the 1960s cannot be told without acknowledging this influence. The Mafia didn't just stand outside the gates demanding money. They walked through them, sat down at the table, and in many cases became part of the fabric of the industry. From money laundering schemes to the glitzy nights of the Rat Pack, their presence shaped not only the business of movies, but also the culture surrounding them. For audiences, the films of this era remain timeless, but the hidden history behind them reveals a more complicated picture, one where mob bosses and movie moguls found common ground, each needing something the other could provide. It was a marriage of convenience, and like all such marriages, it carried risks. Those risks would come to the surface in later decades as the mob's Hollywood ties were exposed in greater detail. But during the mid-20th century, the partnership thrived, built on money, secrecy, and the allure of power. The curtain was still down, but if you looked closely enough, you could see the shadows moving behind it. By the late 1960s, Hollywood itself was changing. The studio system that had dominated for decades was collapsing. The old moguls were losing their grip. Younger directors were demanding creative freedom, and audiences were shifting their tastes away from musicals and war dramas toward something rawer, more realistic. The country was in turmoil: Vietnam, civil rights struggles, political assassinations, and the movies began reflecting that unrest. Out of this cultural upheaval came a new wave of crime cinema, and once again, the Mafia was waiting in the wings, not just as subjects on screen, but as players behind the scenes. The turning point came in 1972 with the release of The Godfather, directed by Francis Ford Coppola and adapted from Mario Puzo's novel. The film was unlike anything Hollywood had ever produced. It wasn't just another gangster picture. It was an epic, a Shakespearean tragedy that gave depth and dignity to characters usually portrayed as one-dimensional thugs. Audiences were mesmerized. The film shattered box office records, won Academy Awards, and instantly became a cultural landmark. But what most people didn't know at the time was how closely the Mafia had hovered over the production. In fact, the mob initially resisted The Godfather. Real-life crime families, particularly in New York, were worried that the film would bring unwanted attention to their operations. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, a group founded by mobster Joseph Colombo, even organized protests against the movie. Colombo claimed the film promoted negative stereotypes about Italians. Behind the scenes, though, his motives were less about protecting culture and more about protecting the Mafia's image. Negotiations took place between the filmmakers and the League, and eventually compromises were made. Certain words like Mafia and Cosa Nostra were stripped from the script. In exchange, the protests ended and the production moved forward. Ironically, once the film came out, many mobsters loved it. They saw themselves reflected in Marlon Brando's dignified Don Vito Corleone or Al Pacino's calculating Michael. Instead of feeling insulted, they felt flattered. Some even began mimicking the way the characters spoke and dressed. For the first time, the line between Hollywood's version of the mob and the mob's version of itself blurred almost completely. Rocky, The Godfather's success changed everything. Suddenly, gangsters weren't just villains, they were cultural icons. Their code of loyalty, their family dinners, their quiet ruthlessness became part of the American imagination. Mobsters in real life embraced the film, quoting lines, imitating gestures, and even asking to be photographed like their on-screen counterparts. FBI surveillance during the 1970s even recorded mobsters referencing scenes from The Godfather as though they were instructional guides. What had started as a movie was now feeding back into reality. For Hollywood, this meant a new wave of gangster films. Studios realized audiences were fascinated not just with crime, but with the psychology and culture of organized crime. Coppola returned with The Godfather Part II in 1974, deepening the saga and further mythologizing the mob. It became clear that these films weren't just entertainment. They were shaping how Americans and even mobsters themselves thought about organized crime. But the Mafia wasn't just watching from the seats. Some mobsters were directly involved in the productions, offering consulting services to ensure authenticity. In some cases, these services were voluntary. Mobsters simply enjoyed being close to the spotlight. In others, they were demanded. A producer who wanted to film in certain neighborhoods in New York might find himself needing permission from local mob bosses. Equipment rentals, catering services, even extras on set could all fall under mob influence. Hollywood's attempt at realism meant filming on the streets where the real mob ruled, and that made cooperation unavoidable. The late 1970s brought another filmmaker into the mix, Martin Scorsese. With films like Mean Streets, 1973, and later Taxi Driver, 1976, Scorsese began carving out a niche as a director, unafraid to show the raw, unpolished side of urban life. His characters weren't glamorous. They were street-level hustlers, small-time operators, the kinds of men who lived in the shadows of bigger crime families. Scorsese himself, raised in New York's Little Italy, understood that world intimately. When he moved on to larger gangster projects in the 1980s and 90s, real mobsters took notice. By the time Scorsese released Goodfellas in 1990, the relationship between Hollywood and the Mafia had come full circle. The film was based on Nicholas Pileggi's book, Wise Guy, the true story of Henry Hill, a mob associate who turned informant. Scorsese's commitment to authenticity meant that real gangsters were consulted during production. Actors like Robert De Niro, Ray Liotta, and Joe Pesci studied the mannerisms, speech patterns, and behaviors of actual mobsters. Pesci's infamous funny house scene, one of the most memorable in the film, was inspired directly by stories he'd heard from real wise guys. Mobsters themselves were fascinated by the movie. Some loved the attention, bragging that their world was finally being shown as it really was. Others despised it, feeling betrayed by the exposure of their secrets. The FBI, for its part, was thrilled. They saw Goodfellas as almost an instructional film, capturing the day-to-day realities of mob life in a way no previous movie had. But the influence wasn't just one way. By the 1980s, mobsters had been so shaped by Hollywood portrayals that some began modeling their own behavior on movie characters. Young gangsters copied the style of The Godfather, dressing more sharply, speaking in the clipped, deliberate tones of Brando's Don Corleone. Others looked to films like Scarface, 1983, with Al Pacino's over-the-top portrayal of Tony Montana as a kind of blueprint for ambition. Law enforcement officers reported that raids sometimes uncovered posters of Pacino or Brando hanging in mobsters' homes. The movies had become both a mirror and a manual. Meanwhile, the unions in Hollywood were still not free of mob control. Though the FBI and federal prosecutors cracked down on organized crime throughout the 1970s, indictments and convictions didn't fully uproot the system. Mob influence lingered, particularly in the Teamsters, whose pension fund became a notorious source of loans for both Las Vegas casinos and, indirectly, Hollywood projects. Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters leader with deep mob ties, oversaw the use of pension money in ways that benefited mob-connected ventures. The boundary between Hollywood Vegas and the underworld was often paper-thin. The cultural impact of these decades cannot be overstated. Gangster films were no longer just entertainment. They were a conversation between Hollywood and the mob itself. Each new movie influenced how gangsters saw themselves, and in turn, their behavior influenced the next round of movies. It was a feedback loop that blurred the line between reality and fiction more than in any other genre. By the early 1980s, audiences had grown accustomed to seeing mobsters not just as criminals, but as complex figures, men torn between loyalty, ambition, and family. Hollywood had humanized the Mafia in ways that sometimes troubled law enforcement. If movies like The Godfather made mobsters look dignified, they also risked romanticizing a world built on violence and fear. But the box office didn't care about those nuances. Crime sold tickets, and the Mafia was now a permanent part of American storytelling. And for the mob, the benefits were tangible. Their cultural power had never been stronger. Being associated with Hollywood gave them prestige, influence, and in some cases, protection. A mobster photographed at a premiere or mentioned in gossip columns suddenly seemed untouchable, more like a celebrity than a criminal. The myth and the reality had merged, and it was getting harder to tell them apart. What began in the 1930s with union racketeering had by the 1970s evolved into something larger, a cultural symbiosis between Hollywood and the Mafia. Each needed the other. Hollywood needed the authenticity, the drama, the mythology. The Mafia needed the legitimacy, the attention, the glamour. And together, they created an enduring image that still defines how the world imagines organized crime. But as the 1980s unfolded, cracks began to show. Federal investigations grew more aggressive, undercover operations penetrated mob families, and RICO laws gave prosecutors powerful tools. At the same time, Hollywood was changing again. Big-budget blockbusters like Star Wars and Indiana Jones were shifting attention away from gritty crime dramas. The mob's golden age in Hollywood influence was starting to fade, yet their legacy remained in the films, in the culture, and in the way America still romanticized men who lived and died by the code of the street. The stage was set for the next chapter, the decline of the mob's direct power, even as their image on screen became more powerful than ever. If the 1950s and 1960s showed how the mob's money seeped into Hollywood's bloodstream, the 1970s and 1980s were the decades when their image became inseparable from the silver screen. Ironically, just as the FBI and federal prosecutors were hammering down on organized crime families, Hollywood was turning mobsters into cultural icons. It was the age of the Godfather, Mean Streets, Scarface, and Goodfellas films that would define what most people think of when they hear the word mafia. But these weren't just works of art. Behind the scenes, mob figures whispered in directors' ears, served as consultants, and even leaned on studios to protect the way they were portrayed. When Francis Ford Coppola was hired to direct The Godfather in the early 1970s, the Mafia wasn't thrilled. Italian-American advocacy groups had been pushing back against negative stereotypes for years. Mob families themselves hated how the FBI and the press were portraying them. For them, a big Hollywood movie about La Cosa Nostra could be either a disaster or an opportunity. The story goes that Joe Colombo, head of the Colombo crime family, got directly involved. At the time, Colombo was running the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a group that often acted like a cultural advocacy organization, but was really just another front for mob power. Colombo's league began protesting Paramount Pictures, claiming the movie would smear all Italian Americans as criminals. Rallies were held, pressure was applied, and before long, producer Al Ruddy realized the mob wasn't going away quietly. So what did he do? He met with them. Ruddy sat down with representatives of Colombo's league, and according to Hollywood legend, they struck a deal. The filmmakers agreed to remove the word mafia from the script entirely. They also agreed to portray the Corleone family with dignity, powerful, yes, violent, yes, but also deeply human with values, traditions, and loyalty. Colombo and his men walked away satisfied. That compromise changed everything. Instead of being just another crime film, The Godfather became an epic, almost Shakespearean saga. Viewers didn't just see criminals, they saw fathers, sons, and brothers trapped in a cycle of loyalty and betrayal. The mob, in a strange twist, ended up looking more like tragic heroes than ruthless thugs. And to this day, that's the image many people carry when they think of organized crime. The mob's influence didn't stop with script edits. Real-life mobsters started showing up on sets. They advised on costumes, slang, mannerisms, and even the smallest details of daily life. Take Gianni Russo, who played Carlo Rizzi in The Godfather. He wasn't just an actor. He had real connections to mob circles. Russo had grown up around wise guys and knew how they talked and acted. His presence added authenticity, but it also blurred the line between performance and reality. Later, in Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, actual mob associates were hired as extras. They weren't exactly in the Screen Actors Guild, but they gave the movie a raw edge. Scorsese, who had grown up in Little Italy, understood that to make his film real, he had to draw from the world he'd seen firsthand. And the mob, oddly enough, was eager to cooperate. For them, movies were free publicity, a way to immortalize their world, even as law enforcement cracked down. By the 1970s, something fascinating had happened. Hollywood wasn't just influenced by the Mafia, it was reshaping public opinion about them. Before The Godfather, most Americans thought of mobsters as thugs, men in dark alleys, gunning each other down. After the movie, mobsters looked noble, tragic, complex. The film made people sympathize with Michael Corleone's impossible choices or admire Vito Corleone's sense of family loyalty. Suddenly, the Mafia wasn't just a criminal enterprise, it was part of America's mythology. Mobsters themselves loved this. FBI wiretaps captured gangsters quoting lines from The Godfather, imitating Marlon Brando's raspy voice, and comparing themselves to the Corleones. Life imitated art, and art imitated life. The mob's reputation, in a strange way, was polished by Hollywood, but this came at a cost. The violence was still real, families were still extorted, unions were still corrupted, and people were still killed. Yet the public, dazzled by Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, began to see mobsters less as villains and more as anti-heroes. The success of The Godfather kicked off a wave of mob-themed films in the 1970s and 1980s. Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets captured the gritty reality of small-time hoods in New York, a film so raw it felt like a documentary. Brian De Palma's Scarface, though about Cuban gangsters, carried the same themes of power, greed, and downfall that echoed classic Mafia stories. Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America turned Jewish and Italian gangsters into almost mythological figures in a sprawling epic about friendship and betrayal. Each of these films wasn't just entertainment, they were cultural touchstones. They showed how crime, capitalism, and the American dream were all tangled together, and lurking behind them, in subtle ways, was the mob's hand, whether through consultants, financing, or simply the threat of getting it wrong. While films were glorifying mobsters, mob money was still flowing through Hollywood in quieter ways. The 1980s saw massive growth in blockbuster filmmaking. Studios needed cash, big cash, and some of it came from less than clean sources. Stories circulated about shady investors backing production companies, some with direct links to organized crime. The mob was always looking for ways to launder money, and Hollywood remained an attractive option. It was high risk, but if a film hit big, it turned dirty dollars into legitimate profits overnight. Independent producers, desperate for financing, sometimes took money without asking too many questions. The mob wasn't running studios outright, but it didn't have to. Just being part of the system was enough to keep their influence alive. And then there were the celebrities. The 1970s and 1980s produced stars who didn't just act in mob films, they lived in the mob's orbit. Frank Sinatra, though more Rat Pack era, continued to be whispered about for his ties to mob figures. Dean Martin, too, carried the aura of someone who knew more than he let on. Actors like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino were lauded for their authenticity, but much of that authenticity came from spending time with real-life wise guys, learning their rhythms, their silences, their sudden bursts of charm and menace. For mobsters, befriending celebrities was always good business. It gave them status, protection, and legitimacy. For stars, knowing mobsters meant access to exclusive clubs, financial backing, and a kind of dangerous glamour. Hollywood and the Mafia fed off each other, each lending the other credibility. But while Hollywood was romanticizing the mob, the U.S. government was tightening the screws. The 1970s brought the RICO Act, which gave prosecutors powerful new tools to target entire crime families. FBI task forces grew more aggressive, bugging mob hangouts, flipping informants, and building cases that would eventually cripple the 5 families in New York. Yet this crackdown only made mob movies more compelling. Audiences watched as real-life bosses like John Gotti strutted across headlines, then saw cinematic versions of those same figures on screen. The line between reality and fiction grew thinner every year. By the end of the 1980s, Hollywood and the Mafia were locked in a strange dance. The mob no longer needed to intimidate studio heads or control unions like they had in the 1930s and 1940s. Instead, their greatest influence came from the stories being told and how those stories reshaped the public imagination. Mobsters became celebrities. Celebrities borrowed the mob style. Movies glorified crime even as real mob families crumbled under federal pressure. It was a paradox. The Mafia was weaker in reality than ever before, but stronger than ever in the culture. And that paradox set the stage for the 1990s, when Hollywood would deliver Goodfellas, Casino, and eventually The Sopranos on television works that cemented the Mafia as America's favorite villains and anti-heroes. By the time the 2010s rolled around, the golden age of Mafia dominance in Hollywood was over, both on screen and behind the scenes. The mob no longer held the kind of sway it once did over unions, theaters, or financing. Federal crackdowns, decades of indictments, and the natural decline of the old families had chipped away at their power until only fragments remained. But if you looked closely, their fingerprints were still everywhere, not in the boardrooms or the contracts, but in the culture, in the stories Hollywood couldn't seem to stop telling. It's ironic, because for most of the 20th century, the mob didn't want attention. They thrived in shadows, in whispers, in the silence of fear. But Hollywood changed that. From the first time producers met with union toughs in the 1930s, to the compromises struck over The Godfather, to the authenticity Scorsese borrowed from the streets for Goodfellas, the Mafia was slowly dragged into the spotlight. What began as intimidation and extortion evolved into cooperation, consultation, and eventually inspiration. Mobsters became characters, characters became myths, and those myths became bigger than the men who inspired them. And in many ways, that was the mob's final victory. Because even as the FBI dismantled crime families, even as the RICO Act tore through their structures, even as the names of their bosses faded from the front pages, their cultural image never died. A new generation might not know who Lucky Luciano or Carlo Gambino were, but they could quote Michael Corleone or Tony Soprano word for word. The real mob lost power. The Hollywood mob gained immortality. There's something magnetic about the way Hollywood has framed the Mafia. The mobster story is more than a tale of crime. It's a reflection of the American dream itself. Immigrants came to America with nothing, faced discrimination, and found a way to build empires in the shadows. It's brutal, it's illegal, it's violent, but it's also ambitious, bold, and uniquely American. Hollywood understood that, and it's why these stories never faded. From Scarface to The Sopranos, audiences kept coming back, not because they wanted to see murder and racketeering, but because they wanted to wrestle with ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and power. The Mafia became a lens through which America examined itself. And in doing so, Hollywood softened the mob's rough edges. For decades, the screen versions of gangsters became anti-heroes, men you could hate and admire at the same time. They were fathers who loved their children but killed without hesitation, bosses who demanded loyalty but betrayed their closest friends, leaders who could inspire and terrify in the same breath. In a way, these characters made the mob larger than life and easier to sympathize with, erasing the real blood and pain that their actions caused. It's no accident that FBI agents often complained that juries were more sympathetic toward mob defendants in the wake of these films. When you've seen Marlon Brando weeping for his son, or James Gandolfini struggling with panic attacks, it becomes harder to see the Mafia as just predators. The art blurred the crime. But for the mobsters themselves, this cultural takeover was priceless. In the 1970s, wise guys were quoting The Godfather. In the 1990s, they were quoting Goodfellas. And by the 2000s, they were watching The Sopranos like everyone else, marveling at how their world had been captured and stylized for prime time. Reality and fiction had folded into each other so tightly that sometimes it was impossible to tell which was shaping which. Young gangsters mimicked movie gangsters, while filmmakers based their characters on real-life mobsters. It was a feedback loop, one that kept the mob alive in imagination long after law enforcement had clipped their wings. By the time digital streaming and social media exploded, the Mafia had become more of a brand than an organization. Clips of Tony Soprano circulated online, memes of The Godfather popped up everywhere, and entire YouTube channels dissected the history of real and fictional mob bosses. People who had never set foot in New York or Chicago became obsessed with the five families, the outfit, and the myths Hollywood had preserved. What had once been the stuff of FBI surveillance was now the stuff of pop culture nostalgia. And that brings the story full circle. The mob first came to Hollywood looking for money and leverage. They found both. But what they walked away with was something even more enduring: legend. They became part of America's storytelling DNA. Just as cowboys once symbolized the frontier, mobsters came to symbolize the dark side of the American dream. Hollywood didn't just tell their story, it amplified it, dramatized it, and enshrined it forever. The irony, of course, is that many of the real men behind these legends died in prison cells, on the streets, or in anonymity. Their empires crumbled, their fortunes vanished, their families turned on them. But the world doesn't remember that. The world remembers Michael Corleone, Henry Hill, Tony Soprano. The world remembers the way Brando rasped, "I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse," or the way Pesci shouted, "Funny how?" or the way Gandolfini slumped in a therapy chair, struggling with his conscience. Fiction replaced fact. Myth outlived reality. And maybe that's the ultimate twist in the Mafia's Hollywood story. The mob spent decades trying to control what people thought of them, intimidating journalists, silencing witnesses, keeping their business in the dark. But in the end, it wasn't the FBI that defined their legacy. It was Hollywood. It was the screenwriters, the directors, the actors, and the audiences who couldn't look away. The mob wanted fear, but Hollywood gave them immortality. So the next time you sit down to watch The Godfather or Goodfellas or revisit The Sopranos, remember that what you're seeing isn't just entertainment. It's the echo of a real power struggle, a shadowy influence that once reached into the heart of Hollywood. It's the story of how criminals became characters, and characters became legends. And though the mob's grip on the movie business is long gone, the movie business will never let go of the mob. Because in Hollywood, death is temporary, failure is temporary, but myth lasts forever. And the Mafia, thanks to decades of films and television, has become one of America's most enduring myths. Not because of who they really were, but because of who Hollywood made them.